It was a Tuesday morning in October 1943, somewhere over the skies of central Germany, and 23-year-old Lieutenant Glenn Duncan was flying his P-47 Thunderbolt at 28,000 feet when he saw them coming. The sun was directly behind the German formation, a classic Luftwaffe tactic, designed to blind American pilots until it was too late. Duncan had been briefed on this. He had studied the reports from the groups that flew before his. He had memorized the diagrams, the approach angles, the firing envelopes. None of it mattered. The first pass happened so fast that two of his wingmen were gone before he could call a warning on the radio. One moment they were there. The next moment they were smoke. What Duncan experienced over Germany that Tuesday morning was the most technically proficient air force ever assembled, a force built on a decade of deliberate, ruthless preparation while America was still building civilian automobiles. And yet, within 18 months of that humiliating introduction, Duncan and men like him would shoot the Luftwaffe out of European skies so completely that German ground troops would report going entire weeks without seeing a friendly aircraft. The story of how that reversal happened, why it happened, what it cost, and what it revealed about two entirely different ways of building a fighting force was classified for years, buried in after-action reports and intelligence assessments that sat in archives while the mythology of German aerial supremacy calcified into accepted fact. The Luftwaffe that met American pilots over Europe in 1942 and 1943 was the most combat-experienced air force in the world, by a margin that is almost impossible to overstate. While American pilots were still learning formation flying over Texas and California, German fighter pilots had been killing enemies for years. Werner Mulders had developed the Rotte and Schwarm formation system during the Spanish Civil War in 1937, a fluid two-ship and four-ship formation built around mutual protection that would eventually be copied by every major air force in the world, including the Americans, who called it the Finger Four. Erich Hartmann, who would finish the war with 352 aerial victories, the highest total in the history of aviation, had refined his approach to aerial combat into a philosophy: see first, decide first, attack first, and never stay for a turning fight. German pilots flew with optical gyroscopic gun sights that automatically calculated deflection angles for crossing targets. Their Focke-Wulf 190, which entered service in late 1941, was so superior to the British Spitfire 5 that the Royal Air Force briefly considered evacuating its fighter squadrons from northern France until an improved model could be fielded. The pilots who flew these aircraft had accumulated something no training syllabus could teach: the specific, granular knowledge of how men actually behaved in the moment before they died. They knew which evasive maneuvers revealed panic, which approach angles gave the defender the least reaction time, which altitude bands allowed recovery from a diving attack. They had learned these things by doing them, over Spain, over Poland, over France, over Britain, over the Balkans, over the deserts of North Africa, and the frozen expanses of the Soviet Union. By the time American pilots arrived in strength over Europe, the Luftwaffe's top pilots had forgotten more about aerial combat than most Americans had yet learned. The misjudgment that would eventually destroy the Luftwaffe did not begin in 1943. It began in 1940 in the offices of the Reich Air Ministry, where planners drew up production schedules based on an assumption that the war would be short. Hermann Göring, whose Luftwaffe had performed magnificently in the quick campaigns of Poland and France, told his staff that a long war of industrial attrition was inconceivable given Germany's early victories. He believed genuinely and completely that the conflict would be decided by the end of 1941 at the latest. He was not alone in this assessment. Hitler shared it. The High Command shared it. The entire German strategic apparatus had been built around the Blitzkrieg model, fast decisive campaigns followed by negotiated peace, with no requirement for the sustained industrial mobilization that a prolonged war would demand. The consequences of this assumption revealed themselves slowly at first, then all at once. Germany produced 15,556 aircraft in 1942. The United States produced 47,836. Germany produced 25,527 in 1943. The United States produced 85,898. In 1944, the final full year of the air war over Europe, Germany managed 39,807. The United States produced 96,318. These numbers are not the product of hindsight or Allied propaganda. They are from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, compiled from captured German production records after the war ended, verified against factory logs and ministry documents that the Germans kept with characteristic meticulousness even as their civilization collapsed around them. Goering had dismissed American industrial claims as fantasy when Roosevelt announced a production target of 50,000 aircraft per year in 1940. By 1944, American factories were building nearly twice that number. The pilot production gap was equally devastating and even harder to close than the equipment shortage. Germany trained its pilots through a system that emphasized quality above all else. A Luftwaffe fighter pilot typically received 200 to 210 flying hours before entering combat, supplemented by rigorous ground school instruction in aerodynamics, navigation, and tactical theory. The system produced excellent pilots. The problem was that it was slow, and the war was not. When the Luftwaffe began suffering serious attrition over Britain in 1940, losing experienced pilots faster than replacements could be trained, German planners confronted a structural crisis they had never anticipated. The training pipeline could not be accelerated without sacrificing quality, and sacrificing quality meant pilots who died in their first engagement rather than their 10th. German commanders chose quality and paid for it with numbers. American pilot training followed a different logic from the beginning. The Army Air Force's Training Command, established in 1941 under General Barton Yunt, was designed around industrial principles rather than craft principles. It was built to produce large quantities of competent pilots quickly, using standardized curricula, dedicated training aircraft, and a pipeline that could be scaled to meet whatever production demands the war generated. The system was relentless in its ambition. In 1939, the Army Air Corps graduated 1,023 pilots. In 1944, the Training Command graduated 89,508. A total of 193,440 pilots completed training during the war. American pilots typically entered combat with 300 to 500 flying hours, depending on the period and the service branch. More total hours than their German counterparts in many cases, though distributed differently, weighted toward basic flight proficiency rather than the specific tactical skills that Luftwaffe training emphasized. The early results of this difference were apparent and painful. The first American heavy bombardment missions over occupied Europe in 1942 revealed gaps in training and doctrine that cost lives before they were corrected. American bomber crews flew tight defensive formations designed to concentrate machine gun fire against attacking fighters, a tactic developed at training ranges against predictable attack profiles. German fighter pilots attacked from angles and at speeds that the training ranges had never simulated. gunners who had qualified as expert shooters in Nevada or Georgia found themselves unable to track targets that appeared for fractions of a second at closing speeds above 400 miles per hour. The losses were steep enough that 8th Air Force commanders began questioning whether the daylight precision bombing campaign was viable at all. The Schweinfurt raids of 1943 brought the crisis to a head. On August 17, 1943, 230 B-17 Flying Fortresses attacked the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, while a second force of 146 bombers struck the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg simultaneously. The dual mission was designed to split German fighter defenses. Instead, it concentrated them. German controllers tracked both formations on radar and directed fighter groups to intercept both simultaneously. American losses totaled 60 bombers, with another 100 damaged severely enough to require extended repair. More than 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured on a single day. The second Schweinfurt mission on October 14, 1943 was worse. Of the 291 B-17s that crossed the German border, 77 were shot down and 122 were damaged. Total losses in the preceding 6 days exceeded 148 bombers and roughly 1,500 airmen. The 8th Air Force temporarily suspended deep penetration missions into Germany. The crisis forced a decision that would transform the air war more completely than any tactical innovation. American planners accelerated development of the North American P-51 Mustang with extended-range drop tanks that would allow fighter escort for the full round trip from England to Berlin and back. The Mustang had existed since 1940, developed initially for the British, powered by an Allison engine that performed poorly above 15,000 feet. When Rolls-Royce engineers installed a Merlin engine in a test airframe in late 1942, the resulting aircraft was so dramatically better at altitude that British test pilots initially refused to believe the performance data. The combination of American airframe design with British engine technology produced a fighter that could escort bombers to Berlin, engage German interceptors on equal terms, and return to England with enough fuel remaining for aerobatics. P-51 groups began arriving in England in late 1943. By early 1944, long-range escort missions were resuming, and the Luftwaffe faced a threat it had not anticipated and could not counter. What followed in the first months of 1944 was not simply a shift in air superiority. It was a systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe's experienced pilot corps, the irreplaceable accumulated expertise that no production increase could replace. 8th Air Force Commander James Doolittle issued a directive in January 1944 that changed the fundamental mission of American fighter groups. Escort was no longer the primary task. Fighters were to attack the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found, in the air, on the ground, at its bases, in its training areas. American fighters began hunting German pilots with the same deliberate aggression that German pilots had employed against everyone else for 6 years. The results appeared in kill ratios that shifted steadily through the spring of 1944. In early 1943, experienced Luftwaffe pilots were shooting down American aircraft at ratios that sometimes reached 4 or 5 to 1. By mid-1944, those ratios had reversed. American fighters were killing German pilots at ratios of 2 and 3 to 1, not because American aircraft had become dramatically superior, though the P-51 was genuinely exceptional, but because the German pilots opposing them were no longer Mulders and Galland and Hartmann. They were teenagers with 100 hours of flying time and no tactical experience, thrown into combat against American pilots who'd been doing this for a year. and had learned every German approach angle by surviving it. General Adolf Galland, the general of fighters responsible for Luftwaffe fighter operations, documented the collapse in terms that left no room for ambiguity. In a report to Göring in January 1944, later recovered and published as part of the post-war documentation, Galland wrote that the Luftwaffe was in danger of losing the air war over Germany. He did not use diplomatic language. The losses in January alone, he wrote, were catastrophic. An entire generation of experienced pilots had been consumed. The replacements arriving from training schools were inadequately prepared for the combat they were entering. The training program had been shortened to generate numbers, and the shortened program was producing pilots who died in their first 3 missions. Göring's response, documented in Galland's memoir, The First and the Last, published in 1954, was to accuse his fighter pilots of cowardice. He told Galland that the pilots were lying about Allied fighter strength over Germany, that no American fighter could possibly reach Berlin, and that the reports of P-51s over the Reich capital were fabrications by men who did not want to fight. Galland offered to have himself and his Staffel demonstrate the opposite. Göring declined. The Reichsmarschall, who had dismissed American industry as capable of nothing but razor blades, was still dismissing American capability 3 years into a war that American industry was winning from the factory floor. The human arithmetic of the pilot war was documented in figures that the Luftwaffe's own records preserve. Between January and May 1944, more than 2,200 German fighter pilots were killed in combat. The monthly attrition rate during the same period ran between 25 and 30% of available pilot strength. A new German fighter pilot entering the force in early 1944 had an average combat life expectancy of approximately 3 missions before being killed, wounded, or captured. The Luftwaffe was not being defeated in tactical engagements. It was being demographically destroyed. The training pipeline that could have replenished it had already been compromised by fuel shortages caused by Allied bombing of synthetic oil facilities and by the decision to accelerate graduation schedules that reduced the quality of replacement pilots, which increased their loss rates, which required further acceleration of graduation schedules in a feedback loop of attrition that had no solution except the end of the war. On the American side, a fundamentally different dynamic was operating. American pilot losses in 1944 were also significant, but the replacement pipeline had been built for exactly this scenario. When a Mustang pilot was shot down over Germany, his group received a replacement within days. The replacement had 400 hours of flying time, had trained against German tactical patterns that had been documented and analyzed from the first days of combat, and arrived with specific knowledge of what had gotten his predecessors killed and what had kept others alive. American training evolved continuously throughout the war in ways that German training could not. After-action reports from returning combat pilots were collected, analyzed, and fed back into the curriculum at training bases in Texas and California within weeks. A tactic that the Luftwaffe was using over France in April was part of the training syllabus in Arizona by June. A weakness in the P-47's performance at low altitude that German pilots had learned to exploit appeared in training exercises before most American pilots encountered it in combat. The institutional machinery for turning experience into doctrine was faster and more systematic than anything the Luftwaffe had built, and it ran without interruption from Pearl Harbor to VE Day. The contrast was visible in the aircraft themselves. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, which remained Germany's primary fighter throughout the war, was a design that dated to 1935. It was continuously improved, receiving more powerful engines, heavier armament, and various aerodynamic refinements, but the fundamental airframe was the same one that had flown over Spain in 1937. German designers were aware of its limitations. Its narrow undercarriage made landing accidents far more common than they should have been, accounting for a significant percentage of total losses throughout the war. Its cockpit was cramped and restricted visibility. Its range was limited. Attempts to replace it with newer designs were repeatedly delayed by production priorities, resource shortages, and Hitler's personal interference in procurement decisions. The Americans changed aircraft types 3 times during the war and transitioned smoothly between them because the training system had been designed for adaptability rather than mastery of a single platform. Pilots who had flown P-40s in North Africa flew P-47s over France and P-51s over Germany. Each transition accomplished in weeks rather than months because the training infrastructure could handle it. The decisive demonstration came on D-Day. On June 6, 1944, the Allies flew 14,674 sorties over the Normandy beaches. The Luftwaffe flew fewer than 300. The force that had conquered the air over Europe in 1940, with 2,500 combat aircraft, could muster fewer than that number in serviceable fighters 4 years later, with American and British factories pouring 20,000 aircraft per month into the war. 2 German pilots flew over the beaches that morning. One was Adolf Galland, the other was Josef Priller, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 26. Together they made a single strafing pass over the beaches and then turned back toward Germany, knowing that any other aircraft they might have brought would have been destroyed within minutes. It was, Galland wrote later, the most embarrassing morning of his life. What the Luftwaffe had built over a decade of deliberate preparation turned out to have a structural flaw that no amount of tactical skill could compensate for. It was built around irreplaceable human expertise rather than replicable industrial processes. The 100 victory aces who had made the Luftwaffe terrifying in 1940 and 1941 could not be replaced when they died. The tactical knowledge they carried died with them. American losses were also irreplaceable as individuals, but the system that had produced them was still running at full capacity, and the pilots it sent to replace them arrived better trained than the ones they replaced because the curriculum had been updated with everything the dead had learned. The pilots who flew over Normandy on D-Day and over Berlin in March 1945 and over Dresden and Regensburg and every target in between were not exceptional men in the way that Hartmann and Mulders had been exceptional. They were ordinary Americans from Ohio and Georgia and Oregon, trained by a machine that had been built to convert civilians into capable combat aviators faster than the enemy could kill them. And in the end, that was enough. It was more than enough. The lesson of what happened to the Luftwaffe between 1940 and 1945 was not that American pilots were braver or more talented than their German opponents. The evidence suggests the opposite was true for most of the war. The lesson was about what you build before the war begins, about whether you optimize for peak individual performance or sustainable institutional output, about whether you plan for the war you want to fight or the war you will actually have to fight. Germany built an air force of artists. America built an air force of a factory. In a short war, the artists would have won. In the war that actually happened, the factory consumed them.